The most teams, the number one seed, and arguably the easiest path for one of its members. Will the Big Ten take advantage? Welcome into the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you being here for the Big Ten Live Show with my partner here, Matt Zemek, Trojans Wire, and myself every Monday night. Make it a staple in your week, your college football week, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Matt, how we doing tonight?
Well, this is so fun. 12 teams, and not just 12 teams, but in a year when we've had parity. This has been a year which brings to mind 2007, when pretty much everyone got dinged up. Now, okay, Oregon, the exception, 0 losses, but really everyone else has, been pretty bruised and beaten up, has tasted its own blood a few times. And I think this is going to be a wide open tournament. I've said before, and I'll say it at the outset here on this Big Ten show, give me the field over Oregon. If you wanted to say that Oregon's the best team in the sport, well, yeah, Oregon hasn't lost. But is Oregon ready to win 3 games? And would I put some hard-earned cash on the Ducks winning it all? I wouldn't. I think chaos is going to be the order of the day. You also have, Boise State and Arizona State as number 3, number 4 seeds. You have a Georgia team that, is going to not have Carson Beck for the Sugar Bowl as the number 2 seed. Like, throw seeds out the window. Throw seeds out the window. They do not offer a real indication of who's necessarily better or who's going to win. It's all about on the given day. And we've seen from one given day to another that there's not a ton of consistency. And one of the other things that we have to say is a lot of people will say about Indiana in particular, who did they beat? They didn't beat anybody. Narrowly, that might be true, but they lost 1 game. And Alabama lost 3, Ole Miss lost 3, South Carolina lost 3. You lose 3 times, you're not going to make it. So going 11-1 and not beating anybody is still better than losing 3 times. I mean, if we were talking about 1-loss Indiana versus 2-loss Alabama, I don't think anyone on the planet would disagree with the idea that Alabama deserves to go because of the high-end wins. But when you're talking a 2-loss differential, 9-3, you lost 25% of your games. And do we want in a sport, college football, where you get the smallest amount of bites at the apple of any sport? In the Premier League, the soccer in England, you get 38 games. You don't have any playoffs, but you have 38 games to win the league. College football, 12. Like the NFL, 17. College football, you get 12 and then maybe a 13th game and then your postseason. So you get the smallest number of bites at the apple. We should not be rewarding teams for losing 3 whole games out of 12. And so I like the message that the committee sent with SMU getting in over Alabama, not being punished for playing a 13th game. That sent all the right messages. It also sent the message that, you know what, Alabama, this time we're actually going to punish you for scheduling Mercer. And that brings up the other point, that if Alabama had played Penn State or Notre Dame instead of Mercer and won, Alabama's in over SMU. And it drives me crazy that people are saying, oh, Alabama shouldn't play anyone out of conference. Whoa. Alabama didn't lose a non-conference game. I get it. You schedule Mercer and you schedule South Florida to give yourself a breather between and before and after those SEC games. But really, finally, we saw Alabama and an SEC team get punished for scheduling an FCS cupcake in late November. If you replace Mercer with a moderately good 8-9 win team and you win, you're going to get in. Like you can overcome 3 losses, but Alabama didn't do that. So the takeaways on that were weird. But to get back to the Big Ten and just to the playoff itself, I'm expecting chaos. I'm expecting unpredictability. I think Clemson, Texas is the only matchup, and I'm wearing burnt orange. That's just pure coincidence. Clemson, Texas is like the only matchup I think is going to be predictable and the home team's going to win. comfortably. I think the other matchups with Big Ten schools, I would say I don't have a really, really strong feeling. I do have my leans. I have my inclinations. We're obviously going to talk about each one, but I'm not like 100% sold that a Big Ten team is either going to win or lose. But I will say, throw the seeds out the window. The seeds do not mean a thing, given the way the bracket shaped up.
Yeah, so just quickly about the teams that made it, missed it, and the seedings, because it's all said and done, and we'll move on and look at the games as they stand. I will say this, that Alabama may have a better team than SMU. Who knows? I don't think it's a slam dunk one way or the other. But best team doesn't necessarily make it. It's about earning the playoff spot. The committee had to make the decision that they made because they had set themselves up in such a way that there was no way that they could drop the 8th seed completely out of the tournament after they had set them in the 8th position after losing an ACC championship game on a 56-yard field goal on the final play of the game. And also it made the statement that the teams that did not play, that their resumes stood pat, that there would be no changing or reevaluation of resumes of teams that did not play over the weekend. I don't necessarily agree with that. Alabama had a win against Georgia, for example. That Georgia resume is better since they defeated one of the best teams in the country again and won an SEC championship. But that was the statement that the committee made. So I think they did the right thing in going with SMU, staying with SMU, and not elevating Alabama or dropping SMU further down the ranks. And I believe it was a difficult decision. The way they set it up, it was not a difficult decision, but Alabama did have the better wins. They had the worst losses. You bring up Indiana. Indiana cannot control its Big Ten schedule. So I'm not saying that that's an easy measurement or determination to make, because on one hand, you can't, in a sense, at least blame. You can penalize, but you can't blame a team for their conference schedule. They had nothing to do with it. You do still have to evaluate the schedule. You do still have to evaluate the games that were played or the games that were not played. And Indiana did have an opportunity, of course, to schedule difficult non-conference games. It did not. It's the only team in the field, I'm pretty sure about this, that did not schedule a difficult non-conference game, that did not schedule a legitimate game. They didn't go out like a South Carolina, obviously, is always playing Clemson. Ole Miss at least played Wake. Is that a difficult game? Not this year, no, but still a power conference team. Alabama went to Camp Randall Stadium, played Wisconsin. Everybody played somebody outside the conference except for Indiana. So that's one of my knocks against Indiana, is that they have to have the weakest 11-1 season in the history of power conference football. They defeated one team with a winning record, and that was 7-5 Michigan. That's a weak looking, and again, they are only 3/12 or 1/4 responsible for that schedule. And they did, aside from the Michigan win, exhibit game control and dominance over these weak opponents.
Absolutely. But before we talk about the playoff, and I know this is a Big Ten show, but I want to raise a larger point that I wrote about at Trojans Wire. And I want to say, this article that I wrote at Trojans Wire over the weekend about Oregon not deserving to play in the Big Ten championship game got about 400,000 reads. It's been one of my most read stories of 2024. And so it's one of those things where if you just say the sentence, free of context, Oregon does not deserve to play in the Big Ten championship game. Well, obviously people are going to think, what? Are you crazy? Have you lost your marbles? Are you out of your mind? Yeah, it sounds incendiary, way over the top, completely ridiculous. But then as soon as you explain that sentence, it all begins to it not only makes sense, it's like, why hasn't this been done? It should be so obvious. So the explanation for Oregon doesn't deserve to play in the Big Ten championship game is that Oregon won the Big Ten. Oregon finished first. It didn't lose a game. There was no tie in the standings. It beat Ohio State. So the Big Ten should have just declared Oregon the Big Ten champion. And then in Indianapolis on Saturday night, it should have been Penn State versus Indiana. Two teams that didn't play during the season. Penn State and Ohio State played. Indiana and Ohio State played. So you should have Penn State and Indiana in what would be called the Big Ten playoff. Now, Indiana fans would say, well, that's not fair to us because we would lose to Penn State, or we might lose to Penn State and get knocked out of the playoff. But if you're Indiana, are you really going to be upset about playing Penn State on that big stage? You get to prove yourself. So you could basically think of it from an Indiana perspective as, this is our playoff game 2 weeks early. All right. And so, and people will say legitimately, all right, that could cost the Big Ten a playoff spot. But would it be like a good, interesting proving ground moment? Wouldn't you want Indiana to qualify for the playoff having won a really big game against a good Penn State team? And it would get really good television numbers as well. There would be so much intrigue. And I raised the companion point, having said that, Oregon should have not had to play in the 13th game this past weekend. Why should the number one seed, the team that's unbeaten, have the injury risk? It should be the lower teams in that Big Ten playoff mix that should have to take the injury risk of a 13th game. Ohio State sitting back and relaxing while Oregon has to play a 13th game. That's backwards. It just doesn't make basic sense. It's not fair to Oregon. So when I say Oregon didn't deserve to play in the Big Ten championship game, it's not because Oregon deserved better. It was being treated worse, right? Oregon deserves to not have to play. It was not as though Oregon shouldn't have been elevated to a stage. It's that Oregon should have had the weekend off. And I made the companion point about the SEC, that Texas and Georgia finishing in the top two and being assured of going to the playoff. If the SEC this past weekend had Alabama play Ole Miss, you could call it the SEC playoff game, or to use NCAA tournament lingo, the SEC bubble game. And that would have been so much more interesting. TV numbers would have been bigger. There were apparently, Dan Wolken of USA Today Sports said there were a couple thousand empties in the upper reaches of Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. There would not have been a single empty seat for Bama Ole Miss SEC playoff bubble game. I guarantee you, TV would have been great. So you're making money for ESPN and Disney if you do that. And most of all, you give Alabama and Ole Miss a chance to play their way into the field. If Alabama beats Ole Miss, if Ole Miss beats Alabama, I think they vault over SMU, right? Because they have that shiny extra quality win. And not only do they have that extra quality win, but it's fresh in everyone's mind. It's your closing argument. So Greg Sankey and the SEC misplayed their cards. The Big Ten shouldn't have had Oregon playing in the conference championship game. And Mark, that I've introduced these ideas weeks in advance of conference championship weekend. And I remain surprised. And people will say, Matt, you should never be surprised when college football fails to do the right thing. All right, guilty as charged. But nevertheless, I could see this coming. If I can see it coming, Greg Sankey should have seen it coming. Tony Petitti should have seen it coming. And I certainly hope that we will treat these conference championship games differently, that we will have a flex game component, that we will turn these games from conference title games into bubble games when merited. That's an important addition. When merited. Those are two very important words. Because if your conference title race is unresolved, okay, then you do play a traditional top two teams in the conference for your championship, for your first round bye. That's fine. But if you have a clear-cut first place team, as there was with Oregon in the Big Ten, as there was with Texas in the SEC, Texas the only team with fewer than 2 losses in the conference, you call that team the champion, and your conference championship game becomes a bubble game between your fringe teams. Better television, you're going to get the advertising dollars, and you get a more satisfying resolution in this 12-team playoff era. College football did not adjust to this reality, and hopefully it will going forward.
Okay. You answered a lot of my questions in your closing statement there, because I had a number of them. So basically, that going into the season, it would be announced by these conferences, we will play a conference championship game if it is warranted. If there is not a clear number one team in the standings, i.e., Oregon's 9-0, nobody else is better than 8-1. Therefore, they are the consensus champions. We don't need a championship game. But if there is a tie for the championship, then we'll play a championship game. Then you go to the bubble format, i.e. the Ole Miss Alabama situation. You mentioned in the Big Ten, Indiana and Penn State. Why would the Big Ten put those two teams on the field?
Because Oregon played Ohio State played Penn State, Ohio State played Indiana. So that was the one unplayed game. So like you're not going for rematches here, if possible.
Okay. All right. I understand the concept. It's an intriguing one, and it's worthwhile. And again, it rewards instead of punishes or penalizes a team that earned a outright championship for the conference. Absolutely. And we're going to see it sometime where we're going to have a situation where let's say in the Big 12 this year, somebody would have finished off, let's say if BYU would have finished off their run and gone undefeated, and Colorado finished with 3 overall losses and 2 in the conference, they could be playing a team that even with a win in the conference championship game would not have a better record over the course of the season in conference play, but they will be the conference champion because they won the game that is designated as the conference championship game. And that's happened in the past as well, but would not be serving toward this 12-team playoff structure. So what do you think about my argument that Ohio State should have been ranked ahead of Penn State? Here's my rationale. Number one,
hey, you don't need to explain yourself. Ohio State won at Penn State. Do we need to carry it any further than that? And Ohio State doesn't have
points, actually.
well, you know, like with the just to raise like a companion point or like a comparison. One of the most under-discussed stories of playoff selection Sunday was, what about BYU? BYU beat SMU head-to-head on the road. They both have 2 losses. If you're going to put SMU in over BYU, there needs to be strong countervailing evidence, meat on the bone, to offset BYU's head-to-head win at SMU. So I raise that point because in the Ohio State-Penn State argument, where's the meat on the bone for Penn State to transcend Ohio State winning in Happy Valley? There has to be something really substantial. And of course there isn't. I think it's a pretty open and shut case.
I do too. And I don't hear anyone talking about it. And again, you've got Ohio State won the head-to-head matchup. It was by a touchdown. Was it a close game? Yes and no. If you watched the game, it was clearly an Ohio State win. Statistically, they had game control. They were the better team. And the game was played on the road in Happy Valley. So that's point number one. Point number two, you've got the Oregon comparison. Ohio State goes out to Oregon, and however you want to phrase it, they either lost by 1 second or 1 play or a pass interference, or they had the ball in field goal range. Penn State played a nice game. It was an entertaining game, but they were constantly down by 1 score, 2 scores, 1 score, 2. They were never threatening Oregon in that game. Plus, they were playing in Indianapolis, not in Autzen Stadium. No comparison between those 2 efforts Penn State had against Oregon versus Ohio State's game against Oregon. Point number 3, who was the next best team in the conference? Indiana. Penn State didn't even play Indiana. Ohio State beat them by 23 points. I don't know how those 2 teams are ranked where they are.
Totally. And so this brings up a point about the seeding. And I've said, don't focus on seeds in terms of who's going to win and how you fill out your bracket. But in terms of the matchups and who got preferential treatment, like there's some big swings and misses here. So like Penn State, 2 spots higher than Ohio State, that's a joke, as you have pointed out. The other thing is, why is SMU ahead of Clemson? Right? Clemson beat them. And I would say, Mark, that just with the 5-12 and the 6-11 matchups, not any other matchups, I don't know about you, I would have loved it if it was the other way. If it was SMU at Texas in a 12-5, and it was Clemson Penn State in the 11-6. To me, that's a better pair of matchups than what we arrived at. I mean, Dabo going up to Happy Valley, like that's just so much sexier. And SMU Texas, like you have the Ron Meyer Freddie Akers rematch from the early 1980s. How cool would that have been? So to me, I wish they flip-flopped the seeds, but it's not just because the matchups would have been better. I think you need to put Clemson ahead of SMU because Clemson won head-to-head, and there's just a one-loss difference. And Clemson's, lost to South Carolina and Georgia, a couple really good teams, and Louisville's not a terrible team. So really, I think that was a missed opportunity. Now, I will give the committee credit in one area. Notre Dame, Indiana is perfect. Gosh, that's perfect. That's magic. And obviously, we're going to talk about that game soon. But I really think the other matchups and the other seedings could have been very different and giving us better games in the first round.
Yeah, it is a strange quirk that you could have a team win a conference championship, and if they're elevated into one of those top 4 seeds, there could be a situation down the road where a team wins a conference championship game and is still ranked below, as is the case with Clemson and SMU, below that other team, but being in one of those top 4 positions, they get elevated automatically by the structure, the format, whereas these two teams, Clemson and SMU, were outside of the bye seeding of the 4. Therefore, the committee's rankings held. That's kind of a quirky situation there. That again, if this, and it will play out at some point, it will happen where there will be that same scenario, but one of them will be elevated into the top 4, and it will be the exact opposite seeding preference. Yeah, but Clemson going to Penn State from a blue blood, just
so much better, right? Right?
Yes, and then SMU in Texas. Yeah, that would have been
let's remember. And again, college football historians. We're both college football historians, and we both love the 1980s. And I made the point on Twitter. I tagged you at the Voice of College Football that the 1981 final AP poll after the January 1982 bowl games, Clemson won, Texas 2. They meet in the playoff. 1982 final AP poll after the January 1983 bowl games, Penn State 1, SMU 2. They both meet. So a lot of early 1980s flavor. But to mention one more thing, a couple of magic moments in early 1980s college football history, you had Bear Bryant in Alabama going to Penn State, and you had Joe Paterno in Penn State going to Alabama in the early 1980s. That was a home and home between those two icons of the game. And so having Dabo Swinney, architect of the Clemson dynasty, going up to Happy Valley, that would have been just so sexy. And SMU Penn State does not resonate the same way. And of course, SMU Texas, would have brought us back to the old Southwest Conference. I just think the committee really whiffed on those two. But again, Notre Dame, Indiana is great, but those other two were definite misses in my mind.
That was a great find that you had there to recollect that those were the standings of the final 2 in the AP rankings in 1981 and 82. That's phenomenal. Penn State, SMU in 82, of course, when SMU did not lose a game, but tied a game against Arkansas 17-all and lost the national championship to a Penn State team that had lost by 3 touchdowns against Alabama in the regular season in Birmingham, but came back and, of course, won the Sugar Bowl against Herschel Walker in Georgia. 81 was Homer Jordan, Perry Tuttle, and the Clemson Tigers going undefeated under Danny Ford, and Texas finished at number 2 as the Southwest Conference champions after defeating Bear Bryant in Alabama in the Bears' final major bowl appearance before his final regular season in 1982.
A magic time. A magic time. A time when, it's one of my first football memories. I'm almost 50 years old, so 81 was my first college football season. The first college football game, period, that I remember watching was the 81 Gator Bowl, North Carolina against Arkansas. And then a few days later was the Pitt, Georgia 1982 Sugar Bowl. And the memory I have on ABC Sports, that was when Pac-Man was all the rage. And so when one team scored a touchdown, they had a single bar helmet, whether it was Pitt or Georgia, and that helmet became a Pac-Man gobbling up the other helmet. Just a magic time. I'm like a kid on Christmas morning right now recollecting that from ABC Sports. And of course, you had Keith Jackson and Frank Broyles, my favorite college football TV announced team of all time. No one's ever going to top it. I mean, Fowler and Herbie, really good. Sean McDonough's great. Brent Musburger, of course, another legend. But Keith and Frank, the ultimate, never, ever going to be topped. A magic time. Absolutely.
And we would watch those Gator Bowl games like they were national championship games on December 29th. That was a Lawrence.
And they often had top 5 teams. Those Gator Bowls had great matchups. Like 1980, you had the Heisman winner, George Rogers of South Carolina, against the runner-up Hugh Green of Pitt. And Pitt, of course, was an 10-11 win program in those superpower years under Jackie Sherrill.
Yeah, and of course Lawrence Taylor leading North Carolina in that 81 game against Gary Anderson, the featured back for Arkansas, who moved on to the San Diego Chargers. And I believe the final score was 34-27, if I recollect.
Something around there. And of course, Lou Holtz coaching those great Arkansas teams.
All right, Matt, back to the here and now. Okay.
And the Big Ten.
And the Big Ten, yes. You have to excuse Matt and I. Once we get on a roll and go down memory lane, it's tough to pull us back, but we make our way back, and here we do. With number 1, Oregon. Of course, they get the bye. They're the only undefeated team in college football, and they will face the winner of Tennessee and Ohio State. They're the number 1 seed. They should have the best draw. They don't.
Yeah, it's funny how it worked out that way. And like we talked earlier about the misseeding of the bracket, like Penn State has a better path than Oregon, right? Penn State has SMU and then Boise State, and then a potentially compromised 2 seed in Georgia. Penn State got a better bracket path than Oregon, which could play Ohio State and Texas. So, I mean, that's not close. That's not particularly close. That the 6 seed gets a better path than the 1 seed. In terms of, well, let's do Ohio State, Tennessee first. Again, Clemson, Texas is the only first-round game where I'm fully convinced that one team's going to win. But if I had to lean relative to the spread, and it's, I believe, Ohio State minus 7.5, maybe 8, I would lean toward Tennessee covering. I think Ohio State probably wins, but I would lean toward Tennessee covering the 7.5, 8, because Will Howard's probably going to throw a pick at some point. But I do think that Ohio State's defense is going to be really good. They're going to be really mad, and I don't see Tennessee's offense being able to score consistently enough to win. In terms of the winner of that Tennessee-Ohio State game versus Oregon, here's the thing. If you're Oregon, you're thinking, you know what? We're the number 1 seed. We're unbeaten. We're the big dogs. We don't care who we play. Like that should be Dan Lanning's attitude, and I'm sure it is Dan Lanning's attitude. So I don't want to misrepresent Oregon's attitude. Like Oregon should think, hey, bring it on. We'll take on anybody. We'll handle it. Like that should be the Oregon perspective, and I agree with that. But talking as an analyst and talking in terms of who's going to win and how the bracket and the playoff are going to shake out, if I'm Oregon, I'm hoping for a Tennessee win because, as shaky as Ohio State is and has been, and as many questions as there are about Ryan Day and all that, there's still a bottom line reality about a potential Ohio State-Oregon rematch in Pasadena in the Granddaddy. And that is simply that, Oregon could be the hungriest team in the world, but there is always a natural hunger for the team that is thinking about revenge. And you can't replicate it if you're the team that won the first game. You might be really, really hungry. Like it's not, I'm not criticizing the team that won. It's not about criticism. It's just, you can't replicate the natural, innate, motivational edge that you get from wanting revenge, wanting to set things right, wanting to punch back at the other guy. And Ohio State, if it gets to Pasadena for the quarterfinals against Oregon, Ohio State will have that. And that's just a powerful thing. And like the better team, Oregon's the better team. I'm convinced of that, but revenge is a powerful thing. And so like if I'm Oregon, I'm thinking, bring it on. We'll take it. We'll take whoever we play, and it doesn't matter. But for me, sitting in the chair and inhabiting the mindset of an analyst, I think it's definitely better for Oregon if it's Tennessee. It just creates a much better natural dynamic for the Ducks. And if you're Ohio State, like you want Oregon, you're thinking about Oregon, like let's crush the Vols and let's get back to Oregon. It's just going to be a natural thing for to light a fire under some fannies in Columbus. So in terms of the whole Oregon-Ohio State situation, that's my initial outlook on that.
Ohio State may be a substantial favorite in this game, but man, I don't necessarily see it. I think they're the better team, the more talented team, but not by much. And who knows what's going on between their ears. And there's more pressure on them, that's for sure, as opposed to Tennessee making its first college football playoff appearance. Just to correct you there, Mason, we appreciate the comments, but I'm always going to call people out just because you got to know where you've arrived when you join the Voice of College Football here. So we're gonna correct anything here. So Penn State did notch a ranked win against Illinois. So Penn State does have a ranked win, if we want to be technically correct on that one. So this Penn State path is starting to get some traction and some talk, because my goodness, did they back into a great situation despite being second fiddle in the Big Ten. A much better path with the SMU game at home, and then of course looking straight at Boise State if they are able to in fact win in the first round.
No question about it. And I think one of the talking points here attached to Penn State getting the 6th seed, I mean, forget about the bracket path for a second. Just, it's notable. Penn State got the 6, Notre Dame gets the 7. So Penn State stayed ahead of Notre Dame 6 versus 7, despite losing in the Big Ten title game. And it's something to note. And part of this is good. Now, I'm not sure I'm fully on board with Penn State staying ahead of Notre Dame, though. Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois, and I get it. Like that's the argument for keeping the Irish below the Nittany Lions. But the good part of all this, the good part of the playoff selection show, in addition to Alabama being punished for playing Mercer, the other part I really liked was teams that played the 13th game in a conference championship game did not get penalized. SMU did not get penalized for playing the 13th game and losing a close game to Clemson. Penn State did not get penalized for playing the 13th game. But here's the nuance, and this is where I kind of push back a little bit and think that Notre Dame should have been ahead of Penn State. Penn State got clobbered. This was not a down-to-the-wire game. Penn State, as you said earlier in the show here at the Voice of College Football, Mark, Penn State was second best from the start of that game until the end. Penn State had its moments. Penn State, kind of kept it close, but Penn State was always the second best team on that field. It was a decisive win for Oregon. Not a blowout, but it was a decisive win. Like, it was clear-cut which team was better. So, if the Penn State-Oregon game ended the way the SMU-Clemson game ended, tie game, 56-yard field goal at the gun, all right, then if you put Penn State one spot ahead of Notre Dame, I don't have too much of a problem with that. But Penn State got its butt kicked. And like, we all know this, that James Franklin Penn State wins all the games it's supposed to win and loses all the games it's supposed to lose. Like, Penn State does exactly what's expected, but nothing more. Penn State is like the king of the 10-2 programs that lose the two biggest games on their schedule. It's not bad, but it's not elite. You can't call it elite when you're always losing those big stage games to equal or better opposition. So I don't like seeing that being elevated. And we should note, the editor of Ducks Wire, Zach Neal, does a great job. Ducks Wire, is enjoying the time of its life. Zach's having a great time there as editor. Does a great job. You should follow what he and the team at Ducks Wire does. But Zach Neal tweeted out after the Big Ten title game, he tweeted out that James Franklin was railing at the officiating disparity in that game. And the disparity was Penn State got called for 5 penalties and Oregon 3. And James Franklin had his bees in a bonnet over that, over a 2-penalty disparity. Stop whining, man. Win a bleeping game against a good team. Just shut up. No one wants to hear what you have to say when you're just a flipping crybaby. Own it. Be a man. You got your butt kicked. Start coaching a little bit better in big games, pal. Beat somebody, and then come and be all indignant. All right? You, James Franklin, do not have the right to talk like that. Shut up.
And they're a pretty substantial favorite here, over a touchdown against SMU. So people are expecting that Penn State's going to win. Wouldn't it be something if that weren't the case? I would not be shocked in any way if Penn State got upset in this game in Happy Valley, but they're the better team. They should win the game. I do think they're a better team than Clemson that just got done beating SMU. And then certainly they'll line up as the superior team in terms of recruiting rankings, talent, everything against Boise State. But again, would not surprise me one bit if Penn State got tripped up in one of those two games.
Let's look at that Penn State SMU game for a moment. We just saw Oregon's speed give Penn State all sorts of problems. Well, SMU has speed, and SMU is going to bring tempo. And other thing to note about that game, it's a noon Eastern game. It's not. Notre Dame plays at night. Ohio State plays at night, but Penn State's playing a nooner. Like that, if you're an SMU fan player, you're liking that. Not nearly as intimidating at noon, where Penn State fans have complained. Why are we playing at noon? And now Penn State's going to play another noon game. Though that makes the environment just a little bit less daunting for SMU. And with that speed, and with the way Tom Allen's defense played against Oregon, I think SMU should score at least in the 20s in this game. I don't know about the 30s, but at least in the 20s. And so Penn State's offense, should be able to do what it wants. But if Penn State trips up, if Penn State commits a turnover, then we're looking at a fairly close game. I do think Penn State probably wins, but SMU's speed is definitely something that could give Penn State problems. If I'm Rhett Lashley and I'm trying to game plan for this, I try and get Kevin Jennings on the move, out of the pocket. I don't want him just dropping back and throwing. I want to use Kevin Jennings as a runner. That's a problem. And he made great plays out of the pocket in the fourth quarter comeback against Clemson. I think when he was just dropping back and firing, it wasn't working quite as well. So using Kevin Jennings as a runner, that's something that the SMU approach and game plan need to incorporate.
So when we look at the 4 teams or the 4 games in the first round between Clemson, Texas, Ohio State, Tennessee, Penn State, and SMU, and of course Indiana going to Notre Dame, how would you rank them? Because they're all not blowout point spreads, but they're all substantial decided favorites in that touchdown to 8-point range. What would be your pecking order of most likely upset on down to the closest game in your estimation?
I would say, Tennessee, Ohio State's it is a 9 versus 8 game. So if Tennessee wins, is it that much of an upset? I don't know. But I think that, Ohio State, you mentioned we don't know what to expect from Ohio State after the Michigan embarrassment. Ohio State could come out like a house of fire and just absolutely smoke Tennessee by 21, or Ohio State could play like a really shaken, rattled team against a Tennessee side that's really confident. So like that's the game that I would probably rate first. That's probably the game where I could see the road team winning more likely than anything else. But I wouldn't be shocked if Ohio State. I wouldn't be shocked if Ohio State rolls Tennessee like that. Tennessee Ohio State. Let me put it this way: Tennessee Ohio State's the game with the greatest level of variance. It's a game that could be Tennessee by 25. It's a game that could be Ohio State by 25, or anything in between. That's the game with the most variance. Texas Clemson, I'm on the record as saying like that's the most predictable game. I think like Clemson's offensive line cannot run block. We saw that. Clemson could not get a first down. Forget about points in the fourth quarter when it was trying to run the clock out against SMU. Just could not run the ball. So Texas's defensive line is just going to feast on Clemson, and that's the long and short of that game. Clemson's not going to score. That's it. So that's at the bottom. SMU's speed could worry Penn State, so I would put that game third, and then I would put Notre Dame, Indiana second. I think that's the second most likely possible upset because you're giving Curt Cignetti a month to prepare, or 3 weeks to prepare. And, I'm just so impressed with him and how he goes about his business. People will say, well, again, Indiana ain't beating nobody. And that might be true. But when you look at what Curt Cignetti has done, and a lot of, I'm here in Phoenix. So obviously a lot of people here in Phoenix think Kenny Dillingham should be National Coach of the Year. In most years he would be, but I think it's Cignetti. And there are two main reasons why I think it's Cignetti over Dillingham for Coach of the Year. And I'll work this into my Indiana Notre Dame outlook. First part is Cignetti did this in year one. Dillingham did what he did in year two. Cignetti walked right into Indiana, and in year one, he didn't need a honeymoon or grace period. He did it right away. So that's ridiculous. That's ridiculously good. The second part is Indiana and Arizona State are not equivalent programs or jobs. Arizona State has a tradition of being good. Dan Devine, Frank Kush, on into the 80s with John Cooper, beating Jim Harbaugh in Michigan in the 1987 Rose Bowl. Bruce Snyder, ASU came within a whisker of winning the 1996 national championship. Ohio State wins that game in the final minute of a very tough, close, hard-fought Rose Bowl. Arizona State has a tradition and a history of being good. Like Arizona State was a very relevant program for like a 25-year period from circa 1970 through that 1996 Jake the Snake Plummer team. Indiana had that 1967 season under John Pont and a few, a holiday bowl under Lee Corso, a few, Copper Bowls and like All-American Bowls, those mid-tier, third-tier bowl games under Bill Mallory. And that's it. Like, Indiana's only huge, amazing season was 67. That's it. So those are not equivalent programs. Arizona State, in Phoenix is the fifth largest metro area in the United States. Indiana is a basketball school that's always had to play in the shadows of Michigan and Ohio State in the Big Ten. And then, of course, you add in Penn State in the 1990s. Not remotely equivalent in terms of degree of difficulty involved. And I know that the Big Ten schedule and the cards worked out well for Indiana with the schedule, but come on. Winning 11 games at Indiana, I made the joke the other day on Saturday, if Beano Cook was still alive, you can just imagine him reacting to this year. And I can imagine Beano Cook saying, it's the only thing that's harder than winning 11 games at Indiana is turning water into wine. You can just imagine Beano Cook saying something like that, right? And it's true. No one's ever done it before, ever. Frank Kush won big at Arizona State. Bruce Snyder had that amazing 1996 team at Arizona State. John Cooper did really well at Arizona State. Indiana's never went 10-0 and never won 11 games in a season ever. So that's why you have to give it to Cignetti over Dillingham. So back to Indiana, Notre Dame, and Cignetti. Cignetti is so impressive because he was able to immediately, didn't need 2 years. He did it in his first year, immediately establishing the culture, the standards, the expectation, the repetition of good habits, being able to play physical, fast, tough football right away. And so now after that, a full season, you're giving this team 3 weeks to regroup, regather. And of course, like Cignetti doesn't even have to motivate him. Like just the obvious nature of playing a playoff game in state, Notre Dame, like it's everything any Indiana football fan ever could have dreamed of. And then as a USC blogger, I watched Notre Dame against USC. And Notre Dame struggled with USC's athleticism, certainly in the secondary. The Irish secondary struggled against USC receivers, and Notre Dame's defense was not physically overwhelming. So I think Indiana can play a pretty competitive game at the line of scrimmage. I don't think Indiana gets physically dominated in this game. I would say that Notre Dame's offensive line poses a very significant challenge for Indiana, but is Riley Leonard in the Notre Dame passing game? Are they going to torch Indiana's defense? I don't know. I think Indiana is so well drilled all around and is physically up for a fight that I don't see Notre Dame pulling away with this. I think Notre Dame wins, but much like Ohio State, Tennessee, the line is just over a touchdown. I think it's Notre Dame minus 7.5. I wouldn't touch this game with a 39.5-foot pole betting wise, but if you put a gun to my head, I would lean to Indiana at the 7.5. If it was 6.5, I would say pass. Well, I am passing, but I would say I don't know if it was 6.5, but at 7.5, I would lean toward Indiana on the line.
For those of you who love comparison scores, here's one for you. Notre Dame 66, Purdue 7, Indiana 66, Purdue nothing. So I guess Indiana wins by 7. I don't know. They both just completely annihilated and trucked poor Purdue, who was just incredibly awful. They had 67 yards of total offense in that game, Matt, against Indiana, the last game of the season, 66.
Indiana scores 66 points. Purdue gets 67 yards. That's crazy. And while we're talking about Purdue, just Barry Odom, what an impressive hire to bounce back from the Ryan Walters disaster. So maybe Purdue has a future.
Yes, folks. Barry Odom, of course, did a decent, okay, marginal job at Missouri. Actually, Eli Drinkwitz, prior to 2023, had a worse record than Barry Odom. So you figured his days were numbered, but he bounced back with his 11-2 year in 2023, and then 9-3 this season. But Barry Odom, of course, went to UNLV, did a masterful job there, making the Runnin' Rebels relevant. You talk about a poor, just deplorable football history. UNLV has one of the worst winning percentages in history, and Barry Odom brought them to 2 consecutive Mountain West Conference championships, but he is the next stop at Purdue, and we'll see what he can do with that program, which with the right coach, the right style, the right approach, i.e. Joe Tiller, Jeff Brom, Purdue has been somewhat of a factor in the Big Ten. We appreciate Adam stopping by. Adam hosts our Rutgers show and brings this to the table for us. Oregon will lose in the semis. And, quote, "It's not easy being green. We'll play after the game. You guys are missing the story. Leaving South Carolina out was a mistake. They are as good as anyone right now." This has been Adam's narrative. He's been on this South Carolina bandwagon for about a month.
It is a hot team, but you know what? You had to beat one of Alabama or Ole Miss, and then you'd be in, and no one would be disputing that South Carolina should be in. It's really that simple. Like this is a case where we have head-to-heads on the record, to make a a differentiation between or among teams. In other cases, we don't have head-to-heads, but in this case, we do. So, just had to win one of those. Also, the LSU game, just win one of those three. You're at 10-2. There's no question you're getting in with the win over Clemson on the road. Just had to win one of three. I mean, look, South Carolina's hot. Alabama has high-end potential. You could also say Ole Miss has high-end potential. Like, I wouldn't want to play Ole Miss in a single elimination game, but I like that, 3-loss teams that aren't conference champions are not in this field. That's good. That's good. Now, you can make the argument on strength of schedule, but, losing 3 games, again, you get only 12 bites at the apple. You lose 3 of them. Even if you have better wins than an 11-1 Indiana team, I just can't do it. I always say this: if the difference in losses is 1, then all those schedule arguments, higher end wins, better losses, all that really comes into play. A 2-loss difference, that's a much harder river to cross.
So yes, Adam is not a big believer in head-to-head. He's called the show a number of times. We've had this conversation. He believes in the last 10 games of the season, i.e. the NCAA men's basketball tournament type of application, which I understand that, because on one hand, we are actually awarding and rewarding, recognizing the 12 most deserving teams over the course of the entire season. A lot of people would like to see the teams that are the hottest or the best at the end of the season need to be rewarded. Now, I understand that we want to see the 12 best teams in the country in the playoff, but by the time they take 2 or 3 weeks off, we don't know what kind of effect that's going to have in separation from who's the hottest at the end of the year. And when many teams are deemed to be hot or quote unquote playing well right now, a lot of people are basing that on one game. Like, one game turns people's thoughts about a team like, oh, they're really playing well. Well, are they really playing well? They played well for one weekend. The last Ohio State's on the skids. They're okay. One game. They did look horrible against Michigan. That's one game. They're not quote unquote not playing well. Like it's a baseball team that's lost 8 of its last 10 or something. And if we're going to go to that extreme for me, Matt, and weight these games, and anytime somebody brings this topic up to me, I then say, well, do we want to attach a metric to this? And then as soon as I frame it that way, they back off of their argument that we should be selecting the hot, because I said, okay, well, what is the statistic that is next to all these teams, regardless of how many metrics you have? What is the first thing we look at? Their record. So instead of seeing 11-1, 10-2, 9-3, are we going to weight these games where the 12th game is worth 12 points and the 11th game is worth 11 points and the 10th game and the first game of the season is only worth 1/12 of what the final game? Or do we really want to go to that extreme where we're weighting the season to determine who's hot? I don't agree with that. I think that the entire resume has to be taken into consideration, and that's just the way it is. And I do believe in head-to-head, regardless of who I think is a better team. And many times I think that the losing team is the better team. I know that there were metrics out earlier in the season after Ohio State went to Oregon that actually deemed them kind of the hypothetical winner of the game because they had the ball in field goal range at the end of the game and they're on the road and the road team gets 3 points and all that business. I get that in theory, but the two teams played a football game and you have to honor the winner of the game.
I totally agree. I want to punch this up from Adam as a follow-up point from him. When South Carolina beat them on Clemson's home field, by your logic, Matt, South Carolina should be in. Really, like, this is a good discussion point here. Clemson is a 3-loss team that's in the playoff. Now, obviously, Clemson got in because it's a conference champion, and conference championships are supposed to matter. But Adam makes a perfectly valid point that, if I think personally, if you are a conference champion and you have 3 losses, that's a sticky situation for me in terms of playoff inclusion. Like, I think if you're a 2-loss conference champion, 1 loss, there's zero debate. But if you are a 3-loss conference champion, the question is raised, should you be an automatic qualifier? I personally would think that, if you're a conference champion but you lost 3 games, I'm not sold on the idea you should automatically get in. If there's a really good 2-loss team, a really good 1-loss team in the field, or that's excluded from the field, I would actually say this relative to what Adam's saying about Clemson and South Carolina. If you are a 3-loss conference champion and you have a head-to-head loss against another comparable team, I would be in favor of a rule saying that head-to-head is a first priority over conference championship. So if you're just asking about Clemson versus South Carolina, those 2 teams in isolation, Adam, I would agree with you. I would say that South Carolina deserves it more than Clemson does. But of course, it's not just a 1 versus 1 for that final seed. You have Alabama there, you have Ole Miss there, and as I mentioned earlier, I think BYU has a better resume and therefore a better case than SMU does, because BYU beat SMU head to head. So there are a lot of things that the committee and the process needs to clean up for next season, and I hope that we'll see some reforms. Not that I'm expecting them, okay, but there are certainly some pathways and some potentialities that could open up a path to reform.
So again, Adam is going a direction that a lot of people would like to go to, and I understand it. He wants to put the entire decision-making process into the hands of capable people who know math and who know football and can put logic to it and determine hypothetically who the 12 best teams are in the country, and regardless of what conference they come from, select a field with the 12 best teams. Or Matt has certainly proposed other numbers of teams, whether that be 16, whether that be 6, 8. I like the tension of the 2 approaches. One being the objective measure of, you won a conference. I don't care if you went. I don't care. There could be a situation, it will never happen, but theoretically, everybody in the conference goes 4-4. Everybody in the ACC goes 4-4. And maybe Clemson lost to South Carolina and Georgia because it didn't matter, their non-conference games, and they won some kind of crazy tiebreaker, 17-team tiebreaker, and they won the conference title and they went 7-6. But that's okay, because to me, that's one part of the equation that we have determined that is objective. If you win a conference championship, you're going to be in the playoff, as long as you're one of the 5 highest ranked conference champions. And then on the other side, the committee is going to fill out the rest of the field with who they believe are the best teams, or the most deserving, or the most accomplished, and the best resume, some kind of combination of all those things. All right. Yeah, when you look at these paths that are possible for some of these teams, Oregon has to play the winner of Ohio State and Tennessee, a difficult assignment for the number 1 seed. On the flip side, the Tennessee-Ohio State winner, let's say it's Ohio State, since this is a Big Ten show, Ohio State would, if chalk holds, would have to go through Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, Georgia to win a national championship. Whoever survives this thing is going to have to go through a gauntlet like we've never seen in the history of college football.
Yes, and one of the things, when you just looking at the top half of the bracket, right? Because we would all agree the top half of the bracket, 1-8-5-4, is tougher overall aggregate than the bottom half of the bracket, 2-7-3-6. One point to make here is that Texas 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 is getting actually a decent path in the first two games, but the thing with Texas, and this goes back to the point I made about the conference championship games and that they need to be handled differently in the 12-team playoff era. Because again, Texas finished first in the SEC, and it was not a first place tie. Texas had sole possession of first place in the SEC standings. If we had Texas declared SEC champion and we used my bubble plan, have the SEC playoff bubble game between Alabama and Ole Miss, you're not having Texas play a 13th game right now. But Texas played the 13th game, and because it lost that 13th game, it fell into the first round. It's not getting a first round bye in the playoff. What do we have here with Texas? Texas will have to play 17 games to win the national championship. And Texas will have to win 4 straight games to win the national championship. That doesn't seem to be the fair way to treat a team which finished first in the SEC in the regular season. And people are going to say, and like narrowly, it's true, Texas didn't play Tennessee, Texas didn't play LSU, Texas didn't play Alabama, Texas didn't play Ole Miss. That is a narrowly fair point, but schedules are what they are, right? And in these larger conferences with 16 teams, you're going to have schedule gaps. Like that's going to happen everywhere. Like you cannot play everyone in your conference with a 16-team league. You could do it in a 10-team league, which the Big 12 was not that long ago. You could play 9 games and it's round robin. It's everyone playing everybody. You can't do that in a 16-team league. So in this new era of the larger size conference, and you're going to have some loopholes in the schedule, there has to be some give and take. And Texas finishing first in the SEC, being made to play a 13th game, and now being asked to play 4 more games. So Texas has to play 17 games. Ohio State, just as a comparison, Ohio State is not having to play a 13th game and gets the added rest. So Ohio State had an objectively worse season than Texas, but Ohio State got last weekend off and has more time to prepare than Texas did. That doesn't make sense. That is not how this should go. The teams that finish 3rd, 4th, 5th in a conference and are on the margins of the playoff bracket, those are the teams that should be playing in the future more often than not. Not always. If a conference title, as I said earlier, if a conference title debate has not, or competition has not been resolved, then you play a true conference championship game. But if you have a resolved debate, if you have a resolved situation in the standings, it's Ohio State and Penn State and Indiana and Alabama and Ole Miss who should be playing on conference championship weekend in bubble games, and the first place teams in these conferences, they should be getting the week off. So Texas being made to play 17 games, more than anyone else, to win a national title, like that is a big competitive imbalance issue raised by this 12-team playoff.
Moose, I see you there in the chat. Yes, consider checking out my book. And Adam, thank you so much for the nice review there. Disputed National Champions, my look at the 1990s, what I consider to be the most impactful decade in college football towards changing the way we determine the champion, from the true polling system on through the Bowl Coalition that was introduced, the BCS 4-team college football playoff era into the 12, and we even project toward the 14. So it's more than a history book, but we take you through the 1990s. We tell you who got screwed, how the rankings worked, what was credible, what wasn't, the storylines, the trajectories in regards to what dynasties were launched, which ones ended, what was the impact of each season. And again, we put those results into the current formulas of the BCS, the 14 playoff, and the 12, and the proposed 14. So the link is there in the description section. It's also in the chat. Matt, Jim R brings up an interesting nuance. Now, I think that this would be a joke, but it would be kind of funny, and it would just be interesting in a year like this year. He is suggesting, and I don't know if he's serious about it, that regardless of record, the defending champion would get into the field, meaning Michigan would, of course, make the playoffs this year.
Well, that point raises for me the 2004 season, right? And you know exactly where I'm going with this, that Auburn was not expected to be good. Oklahoma and USC were expected to be really good. So that's why it was Oklahoma, USC, and with Auburn getting shut out in 2004. So I hate the idea of what happened last season has any bearing on how the rankings or the hierarchy should be for the following season.
Folks, we appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. This is a labor of love from Matt and myself. We do enjoy and appreciate your contributions here at the Voice of College Football, so consider that. You can also hit us up at Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App, and that actually in a lot of ways, without explanation right here and now, a more effective way to contribute. Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App, and you get those links down in the description section. This is our Big Ten Live show that, thanks to Matt, we have resurrected for show number 2 between Matt and myself, show 67 overall, and we'll be here every Monday at 9 Eastern, 6 Pacific time. Matt, any other angles to all of this? Of course, we've got a few more weeks to slice and dice the playoff field and look forward.
Well, I think let's do this one, the Ryan Day angle, right? I think, we talked last week that Ohio State at least has to get to the national championship game. I think, or at least a lot of people think that he has to at least get to the national title game. I think that with the bracket shaping up the way it has, I can kind of hedge or a little bit on that. I think Ryan Day needs to beat Oregon. I think he needs to get to the semis. And, if Ohio State gets to the semis and loses a tough bruising game to Texas, that's still pretty good. Like getting revenge against Oregon, avenging that loss on the schedule, winning 2 playoff games. I think that might actually be enough, to calm everybody down in Columbus with Ryan Day. But if he doesn't get past Oregon, and the fact that it's going to be if Ohio State gets past Tennessee and creates that Rose Bowl, it's going to be a classic Rose Bowl. It's going to be Big Ten against Big Ten against Big Ten, but we know it's big. It's going to have that Big Ten Pac-12 flavor. The classic nature of that matchup will heighten the publicity that comes to the game, but it also would mean that the fallout from a loss would be worse than if it was a non-Big Ten team and a team not from the old Pac-12. So I think Ryan Day, if we're talking about just politically, I'm not talking in terms of recommendation, because I gave my recommendations to Ohio State last week. Hire Mike Vrabel and make a run at Lincoln Riley for offensive coordinator. That's my recommendation. But in terms of just reading the tea leaves and the politics, I do think Ryan Day has to get to the semis. He has to beat Oregon. He has to get to the Rose Bowl and win the Rose Bowl against Oregon if he wants that job to be safe. If he doesn't, I don't think he's going to survive, or at least that's the direction I would lean toward.
I'm going to mix the politics and the football and put it this way to piggyback off of your analysis, that Ryan Day's tenure at Ohio State is a higher level of James Franklin-itis. Ohio State, James Franklin has not been on the field with the 2020 Alabama Crimson Tide, one of the greatest teams of all time, or the Clemson 2019 team with Trevor Lawrence. So James Franklin can't get out of the way of Michigan and Ohio State in the Big Ten. For Ryan Day, it's been at a much accelerated level. He's been on the field with Georgia of 2022 and taken them to the wire. And they generally, outside of that national championship game, and there were a lot of extenuating circumstances with COVID and so forth, have performed well. They just haven't gotten the job done. And considering what we saw against Michigan, I think from a strictly football evaluation of getting a team prepared and also being able to rally a team, much like he did 2 years ago, because I was sitting here right about this time 2 years ago thinking, Wow. I just saw what happened in the fourth quarter against Michigan in Columbus, and they've got everything buttoned up. They're the defending national champs. They have this just huge wealth of confidence, experience, their coach, everything's working for them. They look like they are the defending champs and they are the definitive best team in the country. I know Ohio State, from a pure talent standpoint, can play with them, but how in the world are they going to get their heads screwed on straight in 3 weeks to prepare for that? But the closer the game came, the more I thought, I think they will. Now, they had the right arm of C.J. Stroud, which was a little bit different than what they have now. And so that was their ace in the hole. And obviously, they were a kick away from winning the national championship. So he got that team righted to meet that huge challenge. Can he do that again? And then, of course, they're going to have to do it again and again and again and again. But of course, when you get a team that's talented, that's maybe a bit shaky psychologically, if they can get past the first game, then maybe they get their mojo working and they're off and running.
Yeah, absolutely. And you briefly alluded to it. That Ohio State team, which very nearly beat Georgia, and then would have been a clear-cut favorite over TCU in the national championship game 2 seasons ago. Yeah, you had C.J. Stroud. And C.J. Stroud, by the way, he played his very best game at Ohio State in that Peach Bowl against Georgia. Like, C.J. Stroud was good to very good for most of that 2022 season. Then God-tier C.J. Stroud showed up in Atlanta for that Peach Bowl. Like, the quarterback we saw in his rookie NFL season was the quarterback we saw against Georgia. This Ohio State team, Will Howard, like, that's a Grand Canyon size difference in talent, in ceiling, in potential, in downfield throwing ability, overall acumen, you name it. That's going to make the road harder for Ryan Day and Ohio State in this playoff.
When you talk about the politics and the perception of the situation versus what the actual football is, attached to this has been what Kyle McCord did to Miami, knocking the University of Miami out of the playoffs, throwing for a zillion yards as he has every week this season. He's led the nation in attempts and completions and I think yardage. And I know it's been a little ugly. Anytime you attach your entire football team to a gunslinger, you're going to have your 5 interception game against Pitt, but basically he's carried that team. It much reminds me of Sam Hartman a few years ago for a marginal Wake Forest team that ascended to the ACC championship game, basically based on Sam Hartman throwing the ball 45 and 50 times every game and like 3 good receivers. And that's pretty much all they had. And that's what Syracuse has. Meanwhile, Will Howard's, as you famously say all the time, Matt, was stepping on a rake in Columbus against Michigan, and Kyle McCord's tearing up Miami. And it just brings to light that I don't know. I don't want to make the easy assessment that Ohio State maybe made a bad decision letting Kyle McCord go and not guaranteeing his job, but he did turn in a stellar season. And you also have to figure he most likely would not have been the same Kyle McCord this year in Columbus that he was last year, because that was his very first start. The first time he stepped on the field, that was his first year starting, that he should have been a much better quarterback for Ohio State in 2024 after a full offseason of tutelage under Ryan Day and Chip Kelly. And maybe that wasn't the best decision. It's interesting to wonder what Kyle McCord thinks about all this. That, hey, seeing Will Howard kind of stumbling along, like Kyle McCord played better against Michigan than Will Howard did, that's for sure. And especially when you're grading those performances in terms of, McCord did what he did on the road, Howard did what he did at home, and the talent disparity, of course, like Michigan 2023 was a national championship caliber team. This Michigan team was 7-5. So you grade those performances. Like McCord definitely did better.
than Will Howard did. Not that McCord was amazing, but he was definitely better than Howard if you're just comparing these last two Ohio State versus Michigan games. So does that mean Howard has regrets? Or when you look at what McCord did against Miami and brings in Syracuse with a 9-3 record, there's obviously ample reason for Kyle McCord to feel vindicated and satisfied, but who knows what he's thinking. It's certainly a great fly on the wall, what if type question for sure.
As Ralph says here, Will Howard lost his job to Adrian Martinez and then 2 true freshmen during his time at K-State. All you need to know about him. Why did Ohio State go after him? Ralph, we appreciate you being here all the time for us. And again, it's our Big Ten Live show that we do with Matt each and every Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. Catch Matt's work at Trojans Wire. Anything in particular, Matt, that you'd like to highlight?
Well, a lot of USC players are entering the transfer portal. Running back Quentin Joyner entered the portal, so obviously we're looking at that. But we cover college football nationally as well, and so we're writing about a lot of national type issues. We're writing about the playoff. We're writing about the bowl schedule, and next week we'll talk about the Big Ten bowls more broadly beyond the playoff. So, but like I've been writing about the bowls as well as the playoff. Lots of interesting stuff to contemplate. But again, I'm going to save some of my gunpowder for the Big Ten bowl matchups and the full bowl schedule next Monday here at the Voice of College Football.
Folks, we appreciate you being here. The next time I'll be live is on Iowa Hawkeyes Live. So Big Ten fans, check that out on the Iowa channel Tuesday at 5:30 Eastern. And again, Trojans Wire every day with Matt. We'll see you next time.